Good afternoon, Rita. Welcome. Friends, we're very happy to have the one and only Rita Izsak Jai from Senegal. And I say one and only because whenever the name of Rita comes in Geneva at the UN, the Indian delegation immediately protests, right? And the reason for that is probably as a special rapporteur on minorities, she has been forthright in bringing up issues of communities discriminated on work and dissent since 2009. A very scathing report. Scathing in the sense it's a factual. She has brought out what has been going on in the world, and not just on the Dalits, but in several other communities, but specifically the exclusion, the cruelty that has been faced from this perspective. But since then, she has courageously and forthrightly brought this issue as a special rapporteur. And then she was the member of the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is the monitoring body for the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And she just finished her term, and she continues in several advisory committees. And when she had been also with us as we engaged with the Africa Network of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent. And she's been there in 2019, April, and of course again in May 2019 in Senegal again. And she has bought her ticket and planned to come, but again got affected by COVID, and since then, because of her disabilities and many responsibilities, she's unable to make it. And as much as she also regrets in not being able to be physically with us. But actually, you're surrounded here. We not only have one Rita Izsak, but we have 1, 2, 3 Rita Izsak. So good to have you here, and I think we're able to make up. Importantly, it has been shared with you electronically. She had prepared a strategy paper of strengthening the advocacy at the UN of the communities discriminated on work and dissent. You might not have had time to go through that paper. Some of you may have had time. And with all her experience, she had surveyed the landscape of the entire UN systems, both in Geneva, especially in Geneva, and in New York, the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. And she had put forward certain possible milestones and institutions where interventions will push the pathway towards declaration. So without taking much of her time, invite you, Rita. We are honored to have you. And I do not know if the camera can take you around the whole. I do not know if there's a way, Dipanshu, you can just get. No, this is not working. I'm sorry. Only one, but we are at about 42 people from 16 countries here, and we are at a lovely place called Thomas Berry Place with a lot of space, a lot of greenery. And without much ado, let me hand it over to Mike to you. Over to you, Rita.
I'm really grateful that you managed to set up at least this Zoom connection so I can be with you in spirit, although not entirely physically. And also thank you for just saying all these kind words about me. It is true that I really wanted to dedicate a report to caste-based discrimination when I was a special rapporteur, and it was not quite understood why and why my mandate and my staff covered minorities with talk about castes. And so I think this is why also this forum is so important, and the fact that you, Paul, and your colleagues and the Secretariat pushes for this collective effort for the past quite few years. And I think it just is another sign that we do need to be together and unite our forces and our strength to try to get where we want to be. And as you mentioned, I prepared a report for this meeting, and the report is in front of you. I don't want you to now start reading it because I am here to introduce you the report and to give you the background. But maybe later you can just open the table of contents so that you will have an idea about the structure and what the report covers, and then once you have time during the course of these 3 days you can actually go through it. I hope you will, because I really try to put in a lot of important information to all of you. Maybe about the background of the report. So what we have been discussing with Paul and his colleagues is that the communities that you represent today are coming from so many different regions, and they are in different positions and status in their own societies. And we often feel that when we just struggle for our own community, it can be sometimes ineffective or lonely, and also because our position in our societies can be quite sensitive, as often we are regarded as inferior. So when we fight for ourselves only, it can be discouraging. So the idea behind getting all of us together and thinking together is that we could be so much more, or so much more stronger, so much stronger together than we are separately. And because we come from so many regions, it will be very difficult to target one region. If we wanted to work with the EU only, or with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, it would be very difficult because some of our members would not be able to access these regional mechanisms. So this is why the conclusion is that we have to work with the UN. And when we were preparing for this meeting, we also knew that some of you may have had discouraging or negative experiences with the UN. Some of you don't focus on the UN because you already work with other mechanisms that may be more efficient for you. But at the same time, because we are united as a global group, I think it will be very important to decide, discuss first, and then decide in the course of these 3 days of where we're gonna go as a group together collectively. And the strength of bringing all of us together is that very often, for many of us, there is a protection gap at the moment. Not all the groups that are represented here are qualified or identified as minorities in their respective states. And as Paul said, the Indian government, for example, had a big problem with me talking about Dalits because they said that for them it's not a minority, and they excluded from the protection of minorities. At the same time, there is also an indigenous legal framework protecting indigenous peoples, but many of us do not qualify again or just don't identify as indigenous groups. So the problem is that many of us may fall in between these categories and may not enjoy the necessary protection. It is also because if you look into the definition of minorities, identity is a very important factor, because there is no internationally agreed definition, but everybody assigns to the one of Capotorti, who said in 1977 that for a minority group to be minorities, it is a condition that they want to keep their identity as such. Now, if you think about certain groups who are discriminated based on birth and descent, for example, those who are forced to slavery-like labor, they do not want to assign to this identity. They don't want to keep this identity. It's an inferior identity projected and given to them by the rest of the society. So if you stick to the definition of minorities according to GAP authorities, for example, these groups cannot even be minorities, even if they wanted to, because simply they don't want to maintain the identity that is forced upon them, and they don't sign up to them. And so also if you think about the word descent, and in the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, it is clear that descent is covered by the Convention. But again, some countries, some member states, like India would say, no, for them descent is not covered by the Racial Discrimination Committee because it's a completely different concern. And so I think that with Paul and with the colleagues, we just recognize that it is really high time for us to come together under a different network and to try to draw up our own rights and our own interests, which may be different from the ones of indigenous peoples or minorities who are already protected by these different legal regimes. So that's the background of the report, and this is why I wanted to come up with a kind of a list of possibilities what we're gonna do. Now, it's also important for me to say that Paul is the mastermind behind this global network and the forum, and he and his colleagues have a vision for the future. And so I am only here to facilitate the discussion, but of course my report cannot be standing alone, in a sense that I need you, we need you, all of you, to come and discuss it and then come to an agreement on the future path, on the way forward, like how we are going to do this. So in my report, I am not suggesting anything concrete per se, but I am drawing up different opportunities. And the hope is that during these coming years as well, but days, you're going to look into these potential actions and you will decide what you can commit yourself to, what do you think could work, and then what's the timeline, who are the responsible parties, how do we check and monitor what we are achieving. And so if you look into the table of content of my report, you will see that we have all these introductory paragraphs to the reader about why we are together, why it's important to be together. And then I come to a section on the vision, which again I wrote, but I really would like you to look at it and to tell me if it's something that you agree with, do we need to change this, is it according to your own understanding and your own desires. So I am trying to draw up here a kind of a goal for a year and then also for the near future. And maybe some of you ask now, like, okay, but what's the essence of working with the UN? The UN is so abstract. It's in New York, it's in Geneva. We come from far countries. We try to work with local communities. But I think we need to understand that it's not only that we don't have anything else but the UN at the moment as the only global network or organization that can help us, but also because whatever happens at the UN level will come down eventually to the local level. How? Is that the local groups, the communities that we represent, the NGOs that we work for, can push the government and hold them accountable. And the UN can do it at the same time from the top. So when we work together, the local communities and the national level and the United Nations, believe me, governments can really feel pressure. So whenever we talk about the UN advocacy and what do we do at the UN level, please don't think of it as some kind of a high representation in New York, which is, for itself and it will never affect communities. The goal is, the ultimate goal, that whatever we do at the UN level would come down to the local people. And so what we want to do is to start a global movement that would come down and change people's lives on the ground. It's very important that we see it as a process and not as an isolated action on a very abstract international level. And so this is why in the vision, I talk about how we just need to make UN member states familiar with the expression of communities based on birth and descent. If you look into the UPI process, it has never used this expression. It talks about descent but very often it's about people of African descent, or it's about descent in the context of Haiti, for example, and the Dominican Republic, referring to nationalities. But the member states are not familiar with this concept. So for me, personally, what I'm suggesting is the first thing is how we're going to make sure that those member states and delegates and diplomats who sit in Geneva and New York understand what we mean under communities discriminated based on birth and descent and who they are and what they want and what are the specificities. And so once we start this sensitization at the UN level, through meetings, through briefings, setting up the first contact, then we can see how we can channel this into different procedures. And those of you who are familiar with the UN, you know that there are special procedures, special rapporteurs, independent experts. There are the treaty bodies, the ones that would monitor the implementation of conventions and covenants. So there are many different ways, but the goal is to sensitize first our allies and to make sure that every time that a member state comes to Geneva or New York, they can hear the term based on the verb on descent, they know what it means, and they can keep on bringing it up, raising attention, keeping it on the agenda, and questioning the respective governments about what they do for these communities and how they plan to change their lives. And so we may have goals in 1 year, which is about visibility and understanding, within 3 years, and then within 5 years. And of course, the more we plan, the more ambitious we should be. And here I would maybe just highlight one ambitious goal that we have. I think many of us agree that maybe I'm sure that you already talked about it. It's how we push for a declaration on communities who are discriminated based on work and descent. And there are many ways to do it. It has to be started in Geneva with some of the member states. I also have a section, I think, at the very end of my report on how actually it should be done, what's the right approach. And if you ask me, one personal opinion I have is that it would be worth it to push for a declaration. Because even if it does not happen, it creates for us the space for dialogue and discussion. So once you start the process of talking about it, and then you have a reason to sit down with the different delegations. You can tell them this is what we want. And then the discussion continues. Why do you want it? What's your problem? What are the set of rights that you want to codify? Why are you together like this? And so that would trigger a very important discussion. So for me, I think it would be quite interesting and important and essential even for the movement to start a discussion around a potential declaration. So we would lobby and advocate as a different governments, as the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee. We should push for a resolution by some member states who are friendly and accepting to this idea. See if there can be an open-ended working group, if we can bring in the research, the data, and everything they need to know. And just that would already create the knowledge and the familiarity with our agenda at the Human Rights Council. And so I am encouraging all of us to also think about ambitious goals, because even if it's pushed back, at least the road there would help us greatly in shaping our agenda. And I think it's so difficult for people to listen to a screen for such a long time. So I think I will stop here, because this should be a dialogue and a discussion. As you can see in the paper, I am highlighting almost every possible mechanism and avenue for action, from the different forums and fora at the Human Rights Council to the different mechanisms in New York, then other initiatives. How could we, get involved into important discussions at all levels? I am talking about international NGOs, because I think we also need to sell our ideas to already existing big NGOs, so that if we are not present somewhere, they could represent us and represent our interests. I'm also talking about the business world, how we can sell the so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda in the context of data we do communities also to potential partners, and then how we just increase our visibility, what kind of special days we do, what kind of media, publication. And so it's a long list. So this is kind of an opportunity to cherry pick. And I think in the following days we will be able to have a bit of a reflection what you can do personally, what your organization can do, and then what your networks can do. And then how we all bring this together to have a coherent, coordinated, systematic advocacy approach at the UN level, and eventually, as I said, how we help our communities, because that's the goal. How this will come down as a pressure and hopefully lead us some changes on the ground. So I hope this was useful, not too much, and digestible, and so the floor is yours. I think maybe Paul, you can, because I can't see everybody, so maybe you can facilitate the discussion, and of course I'm here for any questions and listening to your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Rita, for the very helpful and thoughtful introduction that you've given to us about how we can productively think about our strategy around the UN and practical and moral justification for focusing on the UN, which you've highlighted extremely well. The paper that Rita has shared with us gives a rich diversity of possibilities. And this discussion now is to try and focus on what would be the priorities in terms of UN goals. And one of the key questions that we have for this session is, what would success look like for CDWD at the UN? We started to talk about that in terms of declaration. When we think about the possibilities of the UN, one way to think about it is success in terms of norms, so new standards and new declaration. Success in terms of mechanisms, so monitoring mechanisms that review compliance with those new norms. Spaces for participation of civil society in that monitoring process and for dialogue with states. And then a third possible area for success is mainstreaming, ensuring that issues of CDWD are on the agenda of UN agencies, in their action plans, other UN mechanisms, and ultimately of governments, right? We're trying to influence that. I think we have to remember also that the UN is an organization of governments. Governments will take the decisions on everything we put on the table today, ultimately. So we do have to have a political strategy in our minds. But it's also an organization that has agencies that are mandated to cooperate with civil society. They're mandated to support the implementation of human rights standards agreed by the UN. And finally, the UN has independent experts, people like Rita, who are very open to hearing from civil society, and within the powers that they have, are willing to give voice to your issues. And we heard that Rita, in her mandate, was very courageous in standing up to objections of states to her talking about these issues. I think it's an excellent example of what independent experts can offer at the UN. So what we want to do is have some contributions from the floor. What you see as the opportunities and risks for UN advocacy on this issue. This is a chance to share concerns that you may have about our work at the UN. I know many of you have decades of experience of working with the UN. What's important to remember is that this is not the first time we go to the UN with these issues. To a certain extent, there is knowledge about the individual community's concerns. What there's less understanding of is how you see those concerns under a united network, under a united heading. And then we want to talk about names and specific priority targets that we have. Rita's paper has given a rich idea of that. We'll have an opportunity this afternoon to, in working groups, go into more depth on what we would see as those priority goals. But for now, let's start our conversation about any concerns or experiences of working with the UN that you have, that you think are relevant to our planning right now. Are we all on board with targeting the UN? Yes, I think we are. What are some risks associated with that? What should this group be keeping in mind about how to do that effectively, based on the experience that you have of using the UN? The floor is open.
Hi, Rita. This is Julian speaking. Nice to see you on screen. I'm sorry you're not here to see you in the flesh.
I wish I could see you after 15 years, or I don't know how many.
Yeah. Well, I grown a beard in the meantime. You got a lot older. Rita, I want to take up the idea of the declaration, because we had a round table just before we met with you, and a lot of times the delegates here expressed the view that the declaration should be a priority aim of the group. So, and you lay out a few ideas, but I think it would be really helpful for you to give us a few more ideas. How would we practically go about it? What we need to do within the group itself to develop our own ideas and so forth. Because I think this will be one of the major areas of discussion over the next 3 days. Thank you.
Merci Rita, plaisir de vous revoir par vidéoconférence. On s'est rencontré un peu à Dakar lors de notre rencontre de Dakar. Mais ma question, c'est par rapport au réseautage. Vous avez mis des mots assez importants pour qu'on soit entendu, pour que la cause soit défendue auprès des Nations Unies. On doit se regrouper en réseautage, parce que ce n'est pas déjà, ça existe. Aujourd'hui, le Forum mondial des communautés est un espace qui va nous permettre de conjuguer nos efforts pour avoir ces plaidoyers de haut niveau. On a besoin d'avoir des États qui doivent nous appuyer pour mieux nous faire entendre et avoir une cause auprès des Nations Unies. Comment devrait-on aujourd'hui, en tant que participants de différents pays, faire des alliances? Comment peut-on construire des alliances auprès des États pour que cette cause soit entendue au niveau des Nations Unies? Merci.
Sorry, I can hear you so badly. It's so quiet. I'm trying to make up the words, but I really don't hear you well. I don't know. Are you speaking into a microphone?
Vous m'entendez? Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien?
Non, je ne peux pas, désolé. Je ne sais pas, c'est pas assez fort.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez très bien? Vous m'entendez?
C'est un peu mieux. Mais
Non, je voudrais vous demander, est-ce que le Forum global des communautés n'est pas déjà un réseau constitué où il y a déjà des organisations de droits de l'homme qui défendent les droits de ces groupes discriminés par ascendance et le travail? J'ai dit, est-ce qu'il n'est pas, comment pourrait-on constituer des alliances auprès des États pour que notre voix soit bien entendue au niveau du système des Nations Unies?
Comme il y a des problèmes de communication, je vais juste poser une petite question. Ma question est la suivante. Vous parlez des États en parlant de l'ONU, et on sait que pour l'essentiel, pour la plupart des pays, ce sont des représentants qui sont envoyés au niveau du système des Nations Unies. Pour la plupart, c'est beaucoup plus pour répercuter la position des gouvernements. Je donne un petit exemple. Je viens d'un pays où le premier responsable à un moment donné, la position de la société, des populations, des organisations de la société civile ne sert à rien. Le plus important, c'est soigner son image à l'extérieur. Et il fait tout pour envoyer des gens qui défendent son image à l'extérieur. Et les problèmes qu'on évoque ici sont des problèmes nationaux. La question de l'esclavage. Pendant longtemps, la Mauritanie a nié l'existence de l'esclavage, malgré qu'il existait des lois. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire dans ces cas précis? Est-ce qu'on peut réellement compter sur des voix qui ne sont pas les vraies voix au niveau national? Parce que les représentants de l'État, ce n'est pas la vraie voix. C'est la voix d'un dirigeant, d'un président. Qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire?
Okay. I'm really sorry because I'm hearing fractions and I'm trying to put together the messages. I'm not sure I heard everything well. So maybe starting with the... Thank you, Corey, for the additional comments. I think they were so useful. And so maybe about the... I will maybe respond several questions together because about the state reputation and what do we do if the states are interested to keep their positions and it's all about their own interests and not about the civil society voices, and then how do we go to the declaration technically? I think this is why I would advise that we need to group together because, as you said, when it comes to Mauritania, if they hear anything about slavery, they close the discussion. It's point of order, slavery doesn't exist, it's an agenda, and it's impossible to talk about it very often, unfortunately. So this is why I believe that if we come up with a declaration on DWD communities, it would be such a good tool for everybody because all these communities can use it afterwards without being named at the discussion. So even if the member states present will understand that it covers Mauritania and Japan and Nigeria and Brazil and all these countries, if we keep it as a declaration of DWD communities, it can be a clear, somehow discussion about rights and challenges of, in the context of this phenomenon that communities are being discriminated, without naming the groups, because once you start naming these groups, as you rightly said, the state will just jump up and start opposing it. And so for me, the way to go forward is to select a few friendly countries. It should be a cross-regional group, because you know how it is with politics. If it's only Europeans, then the global south may say like, oh, okay, it's an attack against us. If it's only the Asia or Africa, it may be the same, like, okay, this is a political agenda against another region. So I think it would be important to look into countries like Costa Rica, like Senegal. In Europe, we have a few friendly states. I think Nepal is quite open-minded when it comes to tasks. So it would be important to bring together a number of states and then table a resolution first, which would establish the so-called working group, an open-ended working group on working on this issue. And then with the working group, then starts the process. And then this is when we can bring in, our expertise, the research, the data, everything we know. And then this is how the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee would also be involved. But for at least, I think first, it should be this discussion with a few friendly states, see if a resolution can be adopted. Again, it should reflect on the fact that many of these communities are not protected by the minority rights regime or the indigenous peoples regime. So they are not being protected in any means. And then to start a discussion about So what are the rights of these communities and who's done the rights? And for me, of course it's our task to already kind of start drafting the declaration. So we should have it in our hands. Now it's another question, whether it will be used later by the politicians and the delegations, but I think that probably in the coming days you should also start drafting something. Of course it means, a very massive legal work, because the declaration is an important legal document, but at least we can put the elements, what we tackle, right? The discrimination, the stigmatization, the right to self-identification, freedom of restrictions when it comes to labor choice, family life, and then, of course, prosecution for the crimes, participation in these decision-making procedures. So there are already a few specific things that should be laid down, and I think once we have our own draft declaration in our hand, it's easier to start going to these member states and tell them, can you please table a resolution on the need to work on this issue on DWB communities? And then once that work starts, this is when now we can channel in our concerns and our advocacy for codifying these different rights. So I think we have friends and allies. Even I know that in this room there are many powerful advocates who can talk to their own governments, they can talk to their own allies. And so I think that it should start with targeting the Human Rights Council and maybe one member state from each region. If we could have 5 governments from 5 regions who are friendly enough, and then try to table a resolution just to start with, I think that could be a good step. And then let's see how the open-ended working group would continue the work and how we could cooperate with them. So for me that's one way, but maybe the participants in the room, because you are very experienced, maybe you can also share your own ideas and approaches, because my knowledge may also be limited, and maybe there are more creative ideas on how to start this work, but that's my take. Thank you.
Hi Rita, Manjula here. I think one thing which comes in my mind in your presentation was how do we identify ourselves, because if in the context of a country like India, Nepal, even for Brazil, the entire concept of majority and your identity as a non-dominant group. So how do we reflect it more, because we do have special rapporteurs on minority issues who has strongly advocated for our community to be seen more as a minority than a majority group. We do have certain special rapporteurs in the past, whether it is water and sanitation or violence against women, human rights defenders, several racism, contemporary forms of slavery, arbitrary detention, etc., who may not be holding the position, just like you have been a very strong ally. So what do you see their role in terms of supporting the global work which we have taken under community discrimination based on work and dissent? And also the role of international human rights organizations. So they have been a very strong support from organizations like Human Rights Watch or Anti-Slavery International or MRG, Amnesty International. So where do we see their role? Because now it's wider approach, not only focusing on caste, like the issue of Dalits. They have played a very important role. So how do you see their own intervention in terms of research and advocacy work through these international organizations? And the last thing which I want to say is also IDSN, which was formed after the World Conference Against Racism, which focused on Dalit issues. So there is a global platform which we have created. So how do we, because when so many representatives from communities who are discriminated based on descent are here, we should also see what kind of solidarity in terms of the issues which are there in their particular country, which we are not able to see from time to time, because that kind of platform is still we need to see in terms of. So what do you how do you see what kind of strategies we can formulate in terms of raising ourselves at the global level as And I do understand what you are saying, that our identity, and that is something which Paul was also saying, that how do we come out as one particular identity like the indigenous community at the UN level. Thank you so much.
La personne qui m'a précédé, on est en train de parler d'une déclaration qui va venir s'ajouter à tous les traités que les États ont signés et qui va venir s'ajouter à beaucoup de documents qui ont été signés. Et nous savons tous que, pour ne prendre que les cas que je connais en Afrique, les États ont ratifié tous les traités. Ils ont même intégré certains des traités dans leur législation nationale et rien ne se passe. On a aussi un système des Nations Unies.
I don't know, I can't see the room.
It's just me and you here.
I'm trying to communicate from that. Okay, can someone, if I speak, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Rita, we're just taking more questions from the floor. We lost you for a minute and we'll come back to you with questions. We're hearing now from Ibrahima.
Ok. Alors, donc je disais que avoir un document de ce genre, bien sûr, avec une prise en compte de beaucoup de réalités, je me demande s'il ne peut pas faire autre chose. Alors, faire autre chose, d'abord, il me semble que les réalités de nos sociétés ne sont pas les mêmes. Encore une fois, je reviens sur le continent que je connais le mieux, en Afrique. Les castes, l'esclavage sont soutenus par la religion, sont soutenus par les traditions. L'État est incapable à lui seul, malgré les traités, les conventions qu'il signe, est incapable à lui seul de changer ces normes-là. Donc, si on veut vraiment s'attaquer au problème, c'est à la société elle-même de prendre en charge cette problématique. Les Nations Unies sont loin. Et le type d'État qu'on a dans nos pays, ce n'est pas un État qui est capable de secouer le baobab, si je dois utiliser cette image-là. Parce que l'État n'a ni les moyens, n'a ni la volonté d'agir, d'aller dans cette direction. Donc il me semble que, puisqu'on est tous là ici ensemble, ce qui est important de voir, c'est par quel bout de chemin commencer si on veut vraiment aller au fond des choses. Et on a beaucoup fait, je vous ai dit tout à l'heure, on a fait du contentieux. On est allé devant la justice, 2, 3 cas, mais c'était pas, c'est comme dirait l'autre, une hirondelle ne fait pas le printemps. Et quels sont, je pense que ce genre de rencontre doit vraiment nous permettre de discuter quelles sont les actions les plus concrètes qu'on doit mener pour aller dans la bonne direction, plutôt que de répéter. Parce que les déclarations, on en a vu tellement, il y a tellement eu de déclarations partout dans le monde, que je me demande si une déclaration de plus ou de moins va changer quelque chose. Donc à mon avis, il y a lieu de commencer maintenant à interroger nos propres sociétés, que beaucoup n'avons pas fait, à interroger nos propres sociétés, voir sur quel levier vraiment agir à l'intérieur de nos propres sociétés pour commencer. Parce que c'est là où on commencera à s'attaquer à ce que j'appellerais les forces d'inertie. Comme en physique, les forces d'inertie doivent, si on ne les attaque pas, on ne pourra pas faire avancer les choses. Comment déconstruire au niveau de notre propre culture l'idée qu'il y a des hommes qui sont inférieurs et il y a des hommes qui sont supérieurs. Qu'il y a des hommes qui sont en droit différents les uns des autres. Ça, c'est une importante question. Je le dis parce que chez nous, mes concitoyens sont là, une religion aussi égalitaire, en tout cas sur un certain nombre de questions, que la religion musulmane, n'a jamais été capable de régler la question des castes, ni la question comment dirais-je encore, de l'esclavage. Donc, ça, pour moi, c'est là où on devra commencer à peser. Je voulais juste jouer un tout petit peu tu vois, le troublemaker, mais c'était juste pour amener les gens à aller au-delà des questions de déclaration. Parce que c'est comme si on se répétait d'une certaine façon. Et c'est là où j'interpelle la rapporteure spéciale. Parce qu'ils ont fait beaucoup d'actions, il y a beaucoup de visites, mais on ne voit pas de progrès, surtout sur ces questions-là. Il n'y a pas énormément de progrès, il n'y a pas de progrès. Et cela, à mon avis, doit nous amener à repenser les outils qu'on utilise, à revoir les choses que l'on fait pour aller dans une autre direction. On doit toujours utiliser le droit, oui. La dignité humaine, elle est universelle. La non-discrimination, elle est universelle. Mais comment utiliser ces deux concepts? Quel outil utiliser pour que ces deux concepts soient appliqués? Je pense que c'est un peu là où j'ai le problème. Je le dis, madame, parce que récemment, on a fait faire dans le cadre d'une consultation une étude sur 20 ans d'application des traités des Nations Unies, les 9 traités des Nations Unies. Il se trouve que j'ai été chargé de faire le travail sur le Sénégal, les traités d'aide. La conclusion à laquelle je suis arrivé, et le Sénégal est parti à tous les traités des Nations Unies, que chaque fois que un traité traite d'une question où la religion et les traditions sont impliquées, l'État se retire. L'État ne fait absolument rien. Il y a un code de l'enfant qui est sur le bureau de l'Assemblée nationale au Sénégal depuis 7 ans. Personne ne veut le toucher. Parce que simplement, on veut créer un certain nombre d'égalités entre les enfants sur la base de la naissance. Un enfant adultéré, chez nous, jusqu'à présent, est différent d'un enfant qui est né au mariage. Donc, c'est juste pour vous donner une idée que c'est pas aussi simple. C'est pas une déclaration qui va régler ces problèmes. Il faut qu'on aille de plus loin. Je ne veux pas garder la parole. Merci.
Ibrahima has also raised an important issue that it's really no use or less use to continue to work at the UN because there is such a strong resistance at the member state level, and also it is a religious issue, therefore it's extremely sensitive. Now I want to respond primarily to Ibrahima here, because 50 years ago, nobody would look at Dalit issue as a human rights issue, because everybody say it's a religious issue. So with religion, don't treat human rights instrument. You change the mindset of society. So the strategy that people used at that time was, they termed it as social evil. They will kill people, they will exclude people, and they will enslave people, and then call them it's a religious people. To hell with this. Even if it's a religious issue, we want to break any form of resistance which uses religion, which I don't think actually religion intends that, but uses religion as continuing legitimizing to enslave women, children and people to slavery. And I think India is using it, all the southern countries are using it, Africa is using it. I remember when I made an intervention about the Ozu and Oru people in Human Rights Council, at that time it was the sub-commission. The member from Nigeria, he's about, I think 8 feet tall or 7.5 feet tall. He came to me and said, "Brother, you're mistaken. That is history. We don't have it anymore." And I'm telling him, every country says that. But will that stop me? Because the national courts are biased. The communities are biased. The human rights organizations in the country is biased. They are not taking this issue as a human rights issue. So I'm not saying this is the only thing, because in each of our country, there are communities who are fighting at the very village level. And that's a very, very courageous struggle, because that's the most difficult to do. They are fighting at the provincial level. They are fighting at the national level. And we need to support this by giving what I think we call it as a sandwich strategy. You also take up at the UN, because I know in many, the Human Rights Commission in India was established after the Vienna conference. The gender laws in India have come in after the Beijing conference. Now, these did not come just because only the struggles at the ground level. So, what I am requesting my brother Ibrahima is, let's not only focus on work at the regional level. That is important, and I don't think you meant that. That is very important. We need to clearly support it. Like, for example, we do at least about 500 to 600 fact-finding cases in India alone, several organizations together, on how the gender rights of women, especially Dalit women, the child rights, the land rights, the environmental rights, education justice, from the ground of these communities. And we will continue to do that. But 50 years we've been doing, and somebody else is talking about the UN, about us, and our issue is not taken. Now, India, one other experience I will share. The largest that has come in the written world about India is after the World Conference Against Racism, because 200 people we have mobilized and took them we went to Durban conference, challenging our country. And then they started listening to us in India. Not as long as, and the people were saying, the left, especially the left groups in India were saying, oh, you want to go by flight, that's why you want to go to Durban. No. They have belittled us because they feel our issue is never should be be addressed at the UN level. So, my submission is, yes, we have to really put in strength, maybe 75% of the strength, resources, time, we have to looking at the existing laws, as Ibrahima was saying in the thing. But then, if these laws themselves are not being taken seriously, and if there is no standard setting, and I think later Corinne will share about how the standard setting we need to push, we need to work at the level. And I think Rita has very clearly mentioned that it's not that a declaration will solve our problem, but the process of getting the declaration, because it is going to generate a lot of heat, lot of dust, lot of controversy, lot of debate on this. And those debates will strengthen us to put our demand forward, will strengthen the human rights advocates at the UN, will strengthen some states, because it's a political issue, and the different states will have different stakes in taking this up or not taking this up. I think that fight is what we also need to do, and that's in a way, it's a kind of a special task, I feel, that we need to enter into in order to get a legitimacy. Because only now 11 countries are having this. But even these 11 countries, there is no legitimacy at the country level. We can only get legitimacy when the UN begins to address this. And then this issue, these concerns get legitimized.
One thing I'd like to say is that, since the Black Lives Matter movement and then the COVID-19 and the hatred against the Asians, I think that in the UN there is a momentum to focus on racialized groups and those who have been historically marginalized. And so when you talk about the previous initiatives like the principles and guidelines, people are tired of hearing it. So I think there is a danger in trying to go back, to the old documents and issues and somehow make them alive again. This is why I said that I think there is such a momentum now to start something new, because the UN knows that they have to do something about these communities. And there is the UN network of racial discrimination and protection of minorities, and protection of minorities, which has more than 20 UN agencies. And I think many of you in the room know that. This is a key ally, because the Secretariat is OHCHR. There are some really long-term friends who sit there and coordinate this work, this network. And there is ILO inside, UNICEF, UNFPA, UNAP, UNHCR. So it's really a large network, and they are also mandated by the Secretary General to start working more on the country level, country team level as well. So that's one thing to say from me, that I think there is a momentum, so we should really try to use it to trigger new things happening, because people know that they need to do more, and we can use this to mobilize efforts. Number two that I would like to say is, I understand that the situations are very different in every country, and I also have to say at the same time that the situation is also different in every society. There is no country where certain leaders, opinion leaders, will not influence the others. In some societies it's religious leaders, in some others it's traditional, in some others are just influencers at the community level. Also many countries that are different ethnic or religious or national communities, and they have their own leaders. So I would put aside at the moment like what we do with those leaders, because what a declaration can do is to start to pressure governments to regularize certain things. And then how our member states implement those rights and obligations set forth in the declaration is the next step. And so I think it's also important to look into what the Minority Declaration has done to minorities in the past 30 years, because it has indeed inspired a lot of national legislation. The fellowship program, the participation of minorities in processes. So it triggered changes. Did the Declaration on Minorities from the UN solve anything about religious leaders per se? Maybe not, but what it does is that it will pressure governments to come up with laws, policies, and programs to eliminate harmful practices, for example, and then it's up to the government to work with those leaders. And once we have a declaration, or even if we don't have, but we are talking about national pressures now on government, once there is this pressure, we can work better with the government. And so what you also said is about the differences in the communities and the sensitivities of different member states, and then the concepts of minorities and majorities and the silent majorities. But I think that's why it's interesting to bring up this new concept. It's not new, but we will, package it as new with the DWD communities, because this can unite all these different communities, again, without naming and shaming a member state. Nobody signs up, nobody agrees with any kind of discrimination based on birth and descent. ILO conventions forbid it. So they know that this is something that they have to fight against it. So if you can come up with a draft declaration, a codified, like a list of codified rights for these communities, I really think that some of these initial objections of the usual suspects could be a bit minimized. Because as you said, some would be sensitive about their own communities, some would be sensitive about their own regions. But if this is presented as a global issue, affecting global community, the member states will always see, the benefits of adopting something that would also protect others in other communities. Maybe they wouldn't want to talk about their own, because we know, as you said, public image is very important. But if they understand that it goes beyond them, it goes beyond their own country borders, and that could help other people in other situations, and they could champion it. I think sometimes member states buy into this.